Good afternoon. Today we're going to start a new book. It's called Love Comes Softly by Janette Oke. Some of you, I think, watched the movie the other night. They had it on TV. So we'll see if you like the book, and if you like it, it's a series. We can continue on, but maybe we'll take a vote at the end of the book, okay? So, Love Comes Softly. The morning sun shone brightly on the canvas of the covered wagon, promising an unseasonably warm day for mid-October. Marty fought for wakefulness, coming back slowly from a troubled and fitful sleep. Why did she feel so heavy and ill at ease? She who usually awoke with a bounce and a readiness for each new day's adventure. Then, as it all flooded over her, she fell back in a heap upon the blankets from which she had just emerged and let the sobs shake her slight body. Clem was gone. The strong, boastful, boyish Clem who had so quickly and easily made her love him. Less than 2 short years ago, she had seen him for the first time, self-assured almost to the point of swaggering. Then, in only 14 months' time, she was a married woman, out west, beginning a new and challenging adventure with the man she loved. Until yesterday. Yesterday, her whole world had crumbled about her. The men who came told her that Clem was dead, killed outright. His horse had fallen. They'd had to destroy the horse. Did she want to come with them? No, she'd stay. Would she like his missus to come over? No, she'd be fine. They'd care for the body. His missus was right good at that. The neighbors would arrange for the burying. Lucky the parson was paying his visit through the area. Was to have moved on today, but they were sure that he'd stay over. Sure she didn't want to come with him? No, she'd be all right. Hated to leave her alone. She needed to be alone. They'd see her on the morrow. Not to worry. They'd take care of everything. Thank you. And they had gone, taken her Clem with them, wrapped in one of her few blankets and tied on the back of the horse that the neighbors should have been riding, but who was now led slowly, careful of its burden. And now was the morrow, and the sun was shining. Why was the sun shining? Didn't nature know that today should be as lifeless as she felt, with a cold wind blowing like the chill that gripped her heart? Oh, Clem, Clem, she cried, what am I going to do now? The fact that she was way out west in the fall of the year with no way back home, no one here that she knew, and expecting Clem's baby besides, should have worried her. But for the moment, the only thing that her mind could settle on, and her heart understand, was the pain of her great loss. Clem had come out west with such wide excitement. We'll find everything we want there in that new country. The land's there for the taking. What about the wild animals and the Injuns? She had stammered. He had laughed at her silliness and picked her up in his strong arms and whirled her round in the air. What about a house? It'll be most winter when we get there. The neighbors will help us build one. I've heard all about it. They all help one another out there. And they would have. They'd have left their much-needed crops standing in the fields, if need be, while they gave of their time to put a roof over a needy, if somewhat arrogant and reckless, newcomer, because they knew far better than he the fierceness of the winter winds. We'll make out just fine. Don't you worry, you none, Clem had promised. They had stopped at a farmhouse in the area, and Clem had made inquiries. Over a friendly cup of coffee, the would-be new neighbor had informed him that he owned the land down to the creek, but the land beyond that, reaching up into the hills, had not yet been claimed. With an effort, Clem had restrained himself from whooping. The very thought of being so near his dream filled him with wild anticipation. They hurried on, traveling a bit too fast for the much-mended wagon. They were so near their destination when a wheel gave way, and this time it was beyond repair. They'd camped for the night, still on the neighbor's land, and Clem had piled rocks and timbers under the broken wagon in an effort to keep it somewhat level. In the morning, they had found that more bad luck was theirs, for one of the horses had deserted them during the night. His broken rope dangled from the tree to which he had been tied. Clem had gone, riding the remaining horse, to look for help, and now he would not be coming back. There would be no land claimed in his name, nor a house built that would stand proud of its ownership. A noise outside attracted her attention, and she peeped timidly from the wagon. Neighbors were there, 4 men with grim faces, silently and soberly digging beneath the largest spruce tree. As she realized what their digging meant, a fresh torment toward her soul. Clem's grave. It was really true. This horrible nightmare was really true. Clem was gone. She was without him. He was to be buried on borrowed land. Oh, Clem, what do I do? She sobbed until she had no more tears. The digging continued. She couldn't hear the scraping of the shovels, and each thrust seemed to lay bare her heart. Time stretched on. Suddenly more sounds reached her, and she realized that other neighbors were arriving. She must pull herself together. Clem would be ashamed of her. She climbed from the blankets, tried to tidy her unruly hair, and quickly dressed in the dark blue cotton frock. It seemed to be the most suitable thing she had for the occasion. Grabbing a towel and her comb, she slipped out of the wagon and down to the spring to wash away her tears and straighten her tangled hair. This done, she squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and went back to meet her new neighbors. There was a kindness in all of them. She could feel it. It was not a piteous thing, but an understanding. This was the West. Things were hard out here. Most likely every neighbor there had had a similar time. But you didn't go under. You mustn't. You must go on. There was no time nor energy for pity here, not for self, not for one another. It took your whole being to face what must be faced. Death, too, must be accepted as part of life. And though it was hard, one carried on. The visiting preacher spoke the words of commitment. He also spoke to the sorrowing, who in this case consisted of one lone, small person, the widow of the deceased, for one could hardly count the baby that she was carrying as one of the mourners, even if it was Clem's. The preacher spoke words that were fitting for the occasion, words of comfort and words of encouragement. The neighbors listened in silent sympathy to words similar to those that they had heard before. When the brief ceremony was over, Marty turned from the grave toward the wagon, and the 4 men with the shovels turned to the task of covering the stout wooden box that had kept some of the neighbor men up for most of the night to have it ready for this day. As Marty walked away, a woman stepped forward and placed her hand on the slim shoulder. "I'm Wanda Marshall," she said. "I'm sorry that we don't have any more than one room, but you'd be welcome to share it for a few days until you sort things out." "Much obliged," Marty spoke in almost a whisper, "but I wouldn't want to impose upon you. Besides, I think I'll just stay on here for a while. I need me time to think." "I understand," and the woman moved on. Marty continued toward the wagon and was stopped again, this time by an older woman's gentle hand. "This ain't an easy time for you, I know. I buried my first husband many years ago, and I know the feeling." She paused a moment and then went on. "I don't suppose you had time to plan." Seeing the slight shake of Marty's head, she continued, "I can't offer you a place to stay. We're full up at our place. But I can offer you something to eat. And if you'd like to move your wagon to our yard, we'd be happy to help you pack your things. And my Ben Graham, will be more than glad to help you get to town whenever you're ready to go." "Thank you," Marty murmured, "but I think I'll stay me on here for a while." How could she say that she had no money to stay in town, not even for one night, and no hope of getting any? What kind of a job could a young, untrained woman in her condition hope to get? What kind of a future was there for her anyway? Her heavy feet carried her onto the wagon, and her weighted hand lifted the canvas flap. She just wanted to crawl away out of sight and let the world cave in upon her. It was hot in there in midday, and the rush of torrid air sent her already dizzy head to spinning. She crawled back out through the entry and flopped down on the grass on the shady side of the wagon, propping herself up against the broken wheel. Her senses seemed to be playing tricks on her. She swam through unrealism into an intense feeling of loss. Round and round in her head it swept, making her wonder what truly was real and what imagined. She sat mentally groping for some sense to it all, when suddenly a male voice made her jump with its closeness. "Ma'am?" She looked up, way up. A man stood before her, cap in hand, fingering it determinedly as he cleared his throat. She recognized him vaguely as one of the shovel bearers. He evidenced tall strength, and there was an oldness about his eyes that his youthful features declared a lie. Her eyes looked to him, but her lips refused to answer his address. He seemed to draw courage from somewhere deep inside himself and spoke again. "Ma'am, I know that this be untimely. You just haven't buried your husband and all, but I'm afraid the matter can't wait none for a proper like time and place." He cleared his throat again and glanced up from the hat in his hands. "My name be Clark Davis," he hurried on, "and it 'pears to me that you and me be in need of one another." At the sharp intake of breath on Marty's part, he raised a hand and hurried on. "Now hold on a minute," he told her almost as a command. "It just be a matter of common sense. You lost your man and are here alone." He cast a glance at the broken wagon wheel. "I reckon you got no money to go to your folks, if'n you have folks to go back to. And even if that could be, ain't no wagon train for the East will go through here till next spring. Me now, I got me a need too." He stopped there and his eyes dropped. It was a minute before he raised them and was able to go on. "I have a little un, not much more'n a mite, and she be needin' a mama. Now, as I see it, if we marries, you and me," he looked directly at her then, squatting down to put himself more on her level, "we could solve both of those problems. I would have waited, but the preacher's only here for today, and he won't be back through again till next April or May. So it has to be today." He must have seen the look of sheer horror in Marty's eyes. I know," he stammered. "It don't seem likely, but what else be there?" What else indeed, thought Marty's fuzzy brain. "I'd die first, that's all. I'd rather die than marry you or any man. Get out, go away." But he didn't read her raging thoughts and went on. "I've been struggling along, trying to be pa and ma, both for Missy, and not a-doing much of a job of it either, with trying to work the land and all. I've got me a good piece of land and a cabin that's right comfortable like, even if it be small, and I could offer you all the things that a woman be needin' in exchange for you taking on my Missy. I'll be sure that you could learn to love her. She'd be a pert little thing." He paused. "But she do be a needin' a woman's hand, my Missy. That's all I be asking you, ma'am. Just to be Missy's mama. Nothing more. You and Missy can share the bedroom. I'll take me the lean-to. And," he hesitated, "I promise you this, too. When the next wagon train goes through heading east, when you can catch you a stagecoach, if'n you ain't happy here, I'll see to your fare back home on one condition, that you take my Missy along with you. It just don't be fair to the little mite not to have a mama." He rose suddenly. "I'll leave you to be a-thinking on it, ma'am, but we don't have much time." He turned and strode away. The sag of his shoulders told her how much the words had cost him. Still, she thought angrily, what kind of a man could propose marriage to a woman who had just turned from her husband's grave? Even this kind of a marriage. She'd felt despair well within her. "I'd rather die," she told herself. I'd rather die, but But what about Clem's baby? She didn't want death for him, for her sake, or for Clem's. Frustration reigned within her. What a position to be in. No one, nothing, out in this God-forsaken West Country. Family and friends were out of reach, and she was completely alone. She knew that he was right. She needed him, and she hated him for it. I hate this country. I hate it. I hate him, the cold, miserable man. I hate him. I hate him. But even as she stormed against him, she knew that she had no other out. She wiped her tears and got up from the shady grass. She wouldn't wait for him to come back in his lordly fashion for her decision, she thought stubbornly, and she went into the wagon and began to pack the few things that she called hers. They rode in silence in his wagon. The preacher was at the Grahams, where he had gone for dinner. Missy was there too, having been left with the Grahams family for the older girls to look after while her pa was at the funeral. They'd have the preacher speak the words, pick up Missy, and then go on to the homestead. Marty sat stiff and mute beside him as the wagon jostled on. She lifted a half-dead hand to push breeze-tossed hair back from her hot face. He looked at her with concern in his eyes. Won't be too long now. It's powerful hot in the sun. You'll be needing a bonnet to shade your head. She sat silent, looking straight ahead. What did he care about the hot sun on her head? What did she care? Nothing worse could possibly happen to her. She turned her head so that he couldn't see the tears forming against her will. She wanted no sympathy from this heartless man beside her. The horses trudged on. Her body ached from the bouncing of the wagon over the track of ruts that was loosely referred to as the road. She was relieved to see the homestead of the Grahams appear at the base of a cluster of small hills. They drove into the yard, and he leaped lightly down and turned to help her. She was too numb to refuse, fearing that if she tried it on her own, she'd fall flat into the dust. He lifted her down easily and steadied her on her feet before he let her go. He flipped a rein around the hitching post and motioned her to precede him into the house. She noticed nothing of her surroundings. Her mind refused to record anything in its befuddled state. She remembered only that the door was opened by a surprised Mrs. Graham, who looked from the one to the other. She was aware that others were there, apparently waiting for the call to the midday meal. In the corner, she saw the preacher in conversation with a man who she supposed was Ben. Children seemed to be all around. She didn't even try to discern how many. Clark Davis was talking to Mrs. Graham, including the preacher and Ben in his explanation. We has decided. We? She stormed within herself. You mean you? We has decided to marry up while the preacher be still here to do the honors. It will mean a home for Mrs. Claridge here and a mama for my Missy. She heard Mrs. Graham's. It's the only sensible thing to be a-doing. And the preacher's? Yes, of course. There was a general stir about her as the spot was cleared, and in what seemed almost an immoral shortness of time, she was hearing the familiar words. She must have uttered her own responses at the proper times, for the preacher's words came through the haze. Now pronounce you man and wife. There was a stirring about her again. Mrs. Graham was setting extra places at the table and encouraging them to set up and eat with us afore you go on. And then they were at the table, the children having been fed by the older girls before the grown-ups arrived home from the funeral. The preacher blessed the food, and general talk continued on around her. She must have eaten something, though she later couldn't remember what it was, nor if it had been tasty or otherwise. She felt like a mechanical thing, moving, even speaking automatically, with the controls handled by something quite outside of herself. They were moving again, getting up from the table, making preparations to be on their way. The preacher was tucking away a lunch that had been prepared for him and saying the farewells. One of the older Graham boys led the horse up from the barn. Before the preacher left the house, he turned to Marty and, in a simple, straightforward manner, took his hands in his and wished God to be very near her in the coming months. Ben and Clark followed him to his waiting horse, and Mrs. Graham said her goodbye from the open door. Then he was gone. Mrs. Graham turned back into the room, and the men went toward the hitching rail to get Clark's team ready to move on. Sally Ann, you go and get young Missy up from her nap and get her ready to go. Laura, you and Nellie clear up the table and do up these dishes. She bustled about. Marty wasn't sure what she was doing. She was aware only of the movement about her as she sat limp and uncaring. Sally returned, carrying a slightly rumpled tiny figure, who, in spite of her sleepiness, managed a happy smile. Marty noticed only the smile and the deep blue eyes that looked at her. Stranger to the little one. This must be Missy, she thought without feeling. This was verified when Clark stepped through the door and the girl welcomed him with a glad cry and outstretched arms. He swept her up against his chest and for a moment placed a cheek against hers. Then, thanking his host and hostess, he turned to let Marty know that they'd be on their way. Mrs. Graham walked out with her. There were no congratulations or well-wishing on the new marriage. No one had made an attempt to make an occasion of it, and Marty breathed a sigh of relief for that. One misplaced word, no matter how sincerely spoken, would have broken her reserve and caused the tears to flow, she was sure. But none had been spoken. Indeed, the marriage was not even mentioned. These pioneer people were sensitive to the feelings of others. They said goodbye only as one neighbor to another, though Mrs. Graham's eyes held a special softness as she looked up at Marty and said simply, I'll allow you a few days to be settled in, and then I'll be over. It'll be right nice to have another woman so close at hand to visit now and then. Marty thanked her, and the team moved forward. They were again at the mercy of the dusty road and the hot sun. There it be, right over there. Marty almost jumped at Clark Davis's words, but she lifted her eyes to follow his pointing finger. Sheltered by trees on the north and a small rise on the west was the homestead that belonged to this man beside her. A small but tidy cabin stood apart with a well out front and a garden spot to one side. A few small bushes grew along the path to the door, and even from the distance Marty could see colors of fall blooms still upon them. Off to one side was a sturdy log barn for the horses and cattle, and a pig lot stood further back among a grove of trees. There was a chicken house between the barn and the house, and various other small buildings scattered here and there. She supposed that she must learn the purpose for each one of them all in good time. Right now, she was too spent to care. It's nice, she murmured, surprising herself, for she hadn't intended to say any such thing. Somehow in her mind, it looked so much like the dreams that she and Clem had shared, and the knowledge hurt her and made her catch her breath in a quiet little sob. She said nothing more and was relieved when Missy, seeing her home, took all of her pa's attention in her excitement. When they pulled up at the front of the house, a dog came running out to meet him and was greeted affectionately by both Clark and Missy. Clark helped Marty down and spoke gently. You best get you in out of the sun and lay you down a spell. You'll find the bedroom off of the sitting room. I'll take charge of Missy and anything else that be a needin' caring for. It's too late to field work today, anyway. He opened the door and held it while she passed into this strange house that was to be her home, and then he was gone, taking Missy with him. She didn't bother to look around her, but feeling that she must lie down or else collapse, she made her way through the kitchen and found the door off the sitting room that led to the bedroom. The bed looked inviting, and she stopped only long enough to slip her feet from her shoes before falling upon it. It was cooler in the house, and her tired body began to demand first consideration over her confused mind. Sobs overtook her, but gradually her seething emotions subsided enough to allow her to sink into deep yet troubled sleep. Well, that's some way to start out marriage, isn't it? But, I imagine that happened a lot in the West. So this was back in the West. Let me show you the picture one more time. And we'll continue on another day to see what happens to Missy and Marty and Clark. All right, have a good day.